Good evening. My name is Stephanie Javarakis, and I'm a senior at Quinnipiac University. We're here today with Steve Gifford, a candidate for state representative from North Haven. Up until the election in November, we will be doing a series of interviews to introduce you to Steve Gifford and show you his ideas about issues pertaining to North Haven's community. Today, our topic is economic development in Connecticut. Now, Steve, you're a small business owner, and you're on North Haven's Economic Development Commission. Can you please explain the fundamentals of doing business in Connecticut?
Absolutely, Steph, thank you for having me back. I think this is a very helpful tool for North Haven voters to really understand where I'm coming from and make an informed decision. The fundamentals in Connecticut for doing business in Connecticut, and these have very little to do with the government, are really two factors. You want to think about customers and you think about employees. So when you're talking about customers for any business that's either expanding in Connecticut, relocating to Connecticut, starting in Connecticut, Connecticut has a unique role just because of, frankly, population density. We have a lot of people who live here. So that in New Haven County or in Fairfield County, if you put down a pin and you draw a 10-mile radius around it, you're going to have a lot more potential customers in that area than you would if you set up in most parts of North Carolina or in Florida or in most parts of Texas, because we just have a lot of people in the state. If you take that customer concept a little bit further, if you are manufacturing any kind of product, if you are distributing any kind of product, you can put it on a truck in North Haven at 6 in the morning, and it can be in D.C. by noon. It can be in Boston by probably 9. You have, from Connecticut, within a day's drive, you have about 20% of the U.S. population. You don't have that in most parts of the country. So when it comes to customers, companies move to Connecticut, expand in Connecticut because they are very centrally located, and they want people who will buy their stuff. The other side of it, and the other reason that companies locate here and that we are a strong location for companies to be, is employees. Look at the very large employers in Connecticut. You have United Technologies and Pratt Whitney. You have Colt Manufacturing. You have Sikorsky. These are all, to back up and give you an example, when my employees build a fence, if they are off by an inch, off by 2 inches, it's really not going to be a big deal. It's pipe. It's, you know, everything's going to work out. When you're building a jet engine and you're off by an 1/8 of an inch or a 1/16 of an inch, an airplane falls out of the sky. So high technology manufacturers come to Connecticut and stay in Connecticut because we have the machinists, the CNC operators, the engineers, the research and development people who will work to that level of precision. It is true, you can take your factory and move it to anywhere else in the country or anywhere else in the world, but you will have a much harder time finding the people who are going to make a quality product that you can actually ship. This is true outside of manufacturing. That's why a whole bunch of insurance companies are in Hartford, because when you are looking for people who know how to be an appraiser or know how to be an adjuster or know how to do the analysis that comes behind insurance, it's hard to train those people, and it's really easy to hire them from one of your competitors back and forth. So really the two key advantages Connecticut has are the customers it offers to companies and the employees that it offers to companies.
You sure have an incredible insight on what it's like for the economy in Connecticut. Let's backtrack a little bit and talk about your involvement with North Haven's Economic Development Commission. What role do you play in the commission?
Oh, sure. So the North Haven's Economic Development Commission is we're a bipartisan panel appointed by the Board of Selectmen. There's 9 of us, and our job is to foster economic development in North Haven. We do this in a couple of ways. The most visible one is twice a year we have an economic development breakfast, where business owners or people involved in business in North Haven come. We have several speakers. We usually have resources to offer people in terms of either banking or state grants, things like that. First Selectman Frieda usually gives an update to everybody, which is the highlight of it. So we save it for the end, so people don't leave. And it's also a chance for everybody to network. Every time I've been to one, I've met people at my table who are doing something I sort of knew about, but I hadn't run into them before. We're charged with really looking at what things we can do to help the town. And one of the things that I initiated 2 years ago now was working with realtors on the residential side. We're very involved with commercial realtors and trying to attract businesses and development in that way, but the bulk of our real estate economy is residential housing, residential markets. And so we set up an event for realtors, actually in this building just just down the hallway, where we were explaining just some of the demographic issues and the tax issues, so that when realtors are meeting with their prospective buyers, they can say, not just, I think North Haven is great, but North Haven is objectively great for this reason, this reason, this reason, and we had comparisons between us and the towns around us. So that's the kind of things we do on economic development.
All right, so let's go back to the two factors you said that are key.
Sure.
None of those factors seem to involve any sort of government or intervention from the state. What role does the state play in economic development? So
that's an important question, and really key to any kind of campaign, and key to the difference that voters are looking for. I have two answers to that, which is what the state should be involved in and what the state is involved with, and they're two different things. The state's role needs to, aside from the regulatory things where we need to make sure that people aren't, companies aren't dumping bad things into the soil and taking advantage of their workers and the usual things that you would expect from any. The state's real role should be to foster growth, to create the conditions that are going to help, and that takes a regulatory role. Some states favored one business over another just because of what their regulations look like. California is notorious for their non-compete rules, that it's really hard to enforce a non-compete agreement in California. And there's a school of thought that that's why California has so many startup companies, because people can come and go from one to another as they please, because non-competes aren't enforced there. So that's the kind of influence that the state can have and should have. What Connecticut has done under Governor Malloy is something that I understand where we're coming from on it. I'm not sure I agree with it, and I think we may have lived past the necessity of it. What we do and have been doing since the recession started is working on investing in individual companies. So literally companies like mine can apply for a grant from the state, meet a whole bunch of criteria, and there's a fairly exhaustive list of them, and then the state can either give them a loan or give them a grant. The reason that we went to this in the first place was that banks weren't lending money. Plain and simple. The state became the borrower of last resort because banks just weren't going to lend money. And so companies need liquidity, and the state was a way to get it. As much time has gone by, I worry about the state being a venture capital firm. It's not something that we do well, and unfortunately, when the state fails at it, we fail very publicly. You have things like Back Nine Network, which was a golf channel that was going to be started in Hartford, and the state lost millions of dollars on that. The state really shouldn't be picking, okay, this is the company that we're going to fund, this is the one that isn't. It's also a difficult way to attract companies, because you really have to have been established in Connecticut before you can apply for these grants. So companies from outside have a harder time seeing that as an advantage. So I'm sorry, that's a very long answer to your question. The government should have some sort of role in fostering the conditions. I think the way our current leadership has done it needs to be scaled back in terms of directly funding one company or another.
How would you like to see the scaling back change on a state level, if that is the only issue you think needs to be changed?
Well, honestly, the bigger issue is less one of policy and more one of advocacy, and how it almost has nothing to do with the specific process of business funding, but how the state government operates. So much of economic development is perception, relative to much more so than any specific facts, any specific statistics. It is that when people outside of Connecticut perceive our state as being a bad place to do business, it's really hard to talk them out of it. And I think what we need to do is look at those things that have gone into people perceiving this as a bad place to do business. That includes our inability to budget correctly. So for the last 4, 5, 6 years, I can't remember how long it's been, the state will pass a budget, and then 2 or 3 months later, the state government says, well, okay, we don't actually have as much money as we thought. And so then you have this whole thing where the state's going in and cutting and pulling back on programs. And say, okay, we got it, we're good. And then a couple months later, it happens again. Not directly an economic development issue, but it makes our government look like it doesn't know what it's doing. And when businesses outside see that, they look at it and say, well, okay, so maybe the state said they were going to give me money, but they keep cutting things every now and then with no real direction behind it or vision behind it. Things like that, when we do it, it's an unforced error. It's not something we have to. We're never going to compete on being the lowest tax state. It's, our quality of living is not there. We're never going to compete on being the lowest regulation state, and that's a good thing. We don't want to be Texas. We don't want to be North Dakota. But we can compete on being actually good at governing, and this is something that other states look at and business leaders look at and say, I don't feel like they have their acts together. And it's frankly a bipartisan failure of leadership. I don't know, going on a very long time about the budget on an economic development issue, I don't know why Democrats in the House and the Senate and the governor haven't gotten it. So we said, okay, we're going to do a forecast and it's actually going to be right. Because we haven't cracked that code yet. At the same time, I think it's extremely damaging when we have Republicans in the House and Senate taking every opportunity in front of a microphone to say, look at how terrible things are in Connecticut. Look at all this other bad news. Look at these things, because that adds to the chorus. And like I said, perception is the most important factor here. And when senior leaders in the state are saying Connecticut's terrible, everybody's leaving, the state's just going down the drain, when they are part of that narrative, it doesn't help any of us in the state.
This talk about Connecticut kind of pushing people out reminds me a lot of what happened with GE just a few months ago. Do you think that GE leaving for Boston could have been avoided by any way?
I don't know. I think anybody who pretends to have an insight into what GE was thinking is just wrong. And for somebody to say, oh, it was taxes, they were leaving for taxes, that's a very simplistic argument, especially because they went to Massachusetts. Their tax bill is not going to be that different. I mean, they got some subsidies for it, but their tax bill is not going to be substantially different. My view of it is that GE was doing what a number of large companies are doing, which is almost reversing something that they did 40 years ago. So if you remember, you don't remember, I don't remember even, but if you remember 40 years back when GE moved to Fairfield, they were moving out of Manhattan because at the time cities were perceived as not the place to do business and you wanted to do business in the suburbs. Now cities are in vogue and they're going to Boston. I know other Democrats have a long list of reasons that GE moving is not a big deal. And they're not wrong, but it is a big deal because we can't say, okay, GE's moving, sure, but we have these companies moving in. If we had as many coming in as going out, then it would be a wash and it wouldn't really matter. And that's really an important thing to remember on any economic development issue. Our state should not be in the business of saying, this is the most important company that we have. and we have to keep this one, because that's a really dangerous place to be. Where you want to be is in a place where you say, listen, this is a good place to do business, come. Operate here, we'll work with you. If you leave, fine. But in a capitalist society, some companies are going to come and some are going to go. Some are going to go out of business and others are going to start up. That's just, we should expect that to happen. Unfortunately, GE leaving has left a hole, and there's nothing clearly coming in and filling it. I think this really, from a sort of sales point of view, makes me think of sales and relationship management, where I worry that there's nobody in the governor's office or in the economic development department who had a strong relationship with GE, that they were having lunch with somebody at GE once a month. Because if they did, and GE was saying, listen, Fairfield County, there's literally deer that run through our property. We're looking for somebody more urban, someplace more urban. That person with a relationship should have said, New Haven's really nice, and most of your employees won't have to move. They can just commute the other way on 95. I don't think that voice was there at the table, which I think is a major problem that we need to look at. I would say, and this relates to North Haven as much as anything, we have a similar issue. The net job loss for GE is probably going to be 200 jobs. They're still going to have people there. The vast majority of the GE employees were actually part of GE Capital, which is staying in Norwalk. So this is just a few hundred people. The largest employer in North Haven is at US Surgical. So they were Tyco, then they were Covidien, and now they're actually part of Medtronic. They've got, I want to say, upwards of 1,000 employees. But it's a very small plant from the larger corporate point of view. If I'm elected, one of my very first things on the list of things to do is going to be to go to DECD and say, listen, who is in charge of our relationship with Medtronic? And if the answer is nobody, I'm volunteering for that. Because it's a very small corporate decision for a company that size to say, why do we have a plant in North Haven, Connecticut? No, just close it. And that's a very big deal to us. So I want to make sure that we are talking to them, addressing any of their concerns, and making sure that they understand really the competitive advantage they get for having their research and development here in town, having their production in town, and being where they are.
How does North Haven fit into your picture about kind of integrating a relationship between the state and the corporations in order that they stay in Connecticut?
So North Haven is in an interesting position, and I think in town we don't fully realize this until we think about it for a minute. Most people in North Haven don't work at businesses in North Haven. It's less than 10% of the employees in North Haven actually work in town. Sounds like a great job. I would love to be able to bike to work. Most of North Haven residents work in New Haven or Fairfield, in the city of New Haven or in Fairfield County. And so really, we cannot have a narrow focus on just North Haven because we are part of a much larger picture. And when New Haven does well, we do well. When Shelton does well even, we do well. When you can get better train service between New Haven and Grand Central Station, that helps our town. So really, we have to be part of a much larger context and understand that we are a bedroom community. We're not a manufacturing hub in town, in spite of having Medtronic here. And that's okay. I think the amount of green space and open space that we have left, it's probably better that we don't develop, with the exception of a couple of key properties there. So we have to take that point of view. I think to directly answer your question, our sort of role in the region is really dictated by transportation. We have 91 and the Merritt coming through here, and it's the narrowest part where the two of them meet until they come up into Meriden. So that means you can it's much easier to commute from North Haven into Fairfield County or into New Haven than it is from Cheshire, even really than it is from, I would argue, from Gifford or Madison. That's a big advantage to us. We just need to look at it as, okay, we are a destination for the employees to live, not necessarily for the companies to be. And that's an important factor for those companies, no matter where they are.
Now, Steve, if you're elected, what would your economic development priorities be in North Haven?
So I mentioned just the relationship management. I want to get involved in that on the North Haven level, and I really want to push the governor and the state government to make sure that we're not always playing defense, that we're not being surprised by these things. I think the governor did a good thing when North Carolina had their discriminatory bill that they just passed. The governor reached out to a couple of North Carolina companies and said, hey, move here. Well, which is a good move, but that shouldn't be the first time that the governor of Connecticut ever reached out to them or said something. We need an ongoing campaign. It needs to be like any other sales and marketing campaign where we are constant. We have somewhere in the state capitol, there should be a dry erase board that says, here's the top 20 companies that we're going for, and here's what we've done this week to try and get them. And I don't think that exists right now. I think we're much more playing defense and being surprised by things. The place where I'm actually that matches my skill sets as much as anything comes in when you look at these top 10 lists, which I despise. They're poorly formatted. They look at sort of arbitrary criteria, but you always get, oh, Connecticut's among the bottom 10 places to do business, always, no matter what. But when you start picking apart the things that go into those, some of those factors are actually fairly easy to address. And one of them that relates to my professional background is on workers' compensation. We have the second highest workers' comp rates in the country after California. There's no reason for that. We don't get more hurt than any other places. So because I'm a human resources guy at heart, that's one of the things I would want to focus on personally and say, okay, what things do we need to tweak in workers' comp laws to make it so we get out of that bottom 10? What are some of the things we need to tweak in unemployment law to get us out of that bottom 10? What are some of the things in, that we're never going to be a low-tax haven. That doesn't support the education that we need, that doesn't support the roads that we need, that doesn't support the quality of living that we have here. But we can look at doing it intelligently, and frankly, I come back to what I said about the budget. If we're not jerking around from one month to the next saying, how did we lose another $50 million suddenly, we're going to build confidence among not only businesses coming into the state, but residents coming into the state, saying, okay, they seem to know what they're doing.
This is a lot of big picture things in regards to Connecticut. Specifically, how would your plan for economic development positively impact North Haven?
I'm not going to promise a specific thing that this one particular program is going to get us 20 new jobs. I think what I come back to is we are part of a region, and so policies that we have that attract business to New Haven, policies that we have that encourage startups in New Haven or in Branford or in Wallingford, they help North Haven because that's where the jobs are. I think, frankly, probably at another date we'll talk about environmental issues some. I think environmental issues, education issues, quality of life things for people living in North Haven are going to be as important as economic development because we are a bedroom community and we're going to want we want the employees living here even if the companies aren't necessarily in this town.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer some of my questions. Before we go, is there anything you would like to tell the voters of North Haven?
Stephanie, I really appreciate the opportunity to hit on these issues. I'm sorry if I went a little bit long. It's something I feel passionately about. I think the thing that North Haven voters should focus on as we come up, and the election's coming sooner than we think, is just ask every candidate for every office what their plan is, what things they're focused on that are going to make their lives better. Because when business is better, whenever we have more jobs, whenever we have a larger tax base, we can do all of the other things that we want to do. When the tax base is shrinking, when people are leaving the state, when companies are leaving the state, then we're always going to be cutting back on budgets. So all of our policies, all of our wish list for things that state government needs to do start from having a solid economic development, a solid base, jobs for people so that people stay in town and stay in the state and can contribute.
Thank you again, Steve. I appreciate you sitting here. I appreciate you going in depth with a lot of your answers, because I know a lot of residents of North Haven are curious to see who their candidate is. That is all the time we have for today. Please stay tuned to NHTV for other interviews we have with Steve Gifford in the coming weeks following the election.
Thank you, Steph.